Hi, Terry.
Hi there, how are you doing?
It's fine, yourself?
Yeah, good, thanks.
Get some camera in there. See, Andreas prepared the minutes, so I assume he will come.
Okay.
Hello, Andreas. Hello.
Hi.
Hi, Terry.
I saw you prepared the agenda, so we waited for you. I thought you should come.
Yeah, sorry, I was lost on GitHub and lost track of time.
No problem.
I just want to start by making sure that we understand that, you know, despite we're going through a lot of discussion on the feedback on the GitHub repo, it's all intended in a friendly and you know, non-aggressive manner.
For sure.
It's easy to come across as very terse when you're typing into loads of little text boxes, but that's genuinely not the intention at all.
Understood. I think we all share the same vision to make this something good. So that's, of course, yeah.
Thanks, Terry. Yeah, it's not my intention either to come across as aggressive at all. So I hope that's not the impression I'm giving. But I think it's healthy discussion on the topics. But I appreciate all the input for sure.
Yeah, and there's lots of little points that we're starting to kind of touch on now that are all fairly big decisions that, you know, it would be good to get all these settled and standardized and documented. And I think, you know, it's important. It can be, you know, a bit tedious to have to go through in this level of detail and you know, work all these things out. But once we've done it, at least nobody else is going to have to go through it again for a while.
Great. Until we change doc framework or something.
Yeah.
Speaking about that, how have you looked into other GitHub repos, if there are many repos publishing using Doxy and at the same time keeping a decent documentation in GitHub, visually appealing?
I'm not aware of anyone working that way. Certainly with the the stuff that I've been maintaining, we've just gone for, if we're going to render it in Doxy, then that becomes the primary repository, and we do all of the version management against that repository.
Yes, I saw one of those comments around that topic, and I guess we need to decide if we want it to be, I mean, readable, at least in GitHub as well. And I mean, when it comes to images and those things, without too much extra effort needed and such. So maybe we don't need to strive for that. But if we don't have it readable in GitHub, we should of course have it easily updatable for any commit made with previews and such things, I guess, on the docs site. Per pull request, I assume, in some way, if that's possible.
Yeah. So I guess the place to start that discussion is to say, you know, coming in from an outsider and starting to work with this as an external committer would. All of the big challenges that I'm hitting revolve around the fact that we've got the spec in a different repo to the place where we're trying to publish it, and it nearly all the complexity that we're starting to inherit in you know, things like release processes and automation, stuff like that, nearly all derive from that structure. So I think it is worth questioning that at this point and saying, is the value of having this stuff split up worth the complexity that it brings to everything else? Or would it make more sense to put all the documentation in one place and then just maybe maintain the code in a separate place?
Sorry, I was trying to keep notes, but I'm not good at taking notes and thinking and talking. Okay, it's confused.
Unfortunately, I don't have any experience with what we do right now to have visible or readable documentation into places where one is rendered using another framework. So I can't really help too much, I guess, in examples and showing how to do it.
Yeah, I mean that's what we do in Tecton, but in Tecton there is an extra specific reason for doing that, and that's the fact that we have multiple projects, so we have multiple source repos, so that's actually much more complex than what we have in CDEvents. And the reason for that is that we want to, I mean, the documentation is written by maintainers of the different projects. And so it makes things easier from contribution point of view, because contributors already have the correct rights to contribute to the respective repos. So then we collect all the documentation in one place and we publish it through the website. But yeah, so that's definitely more complex than what we do for CDEvents.
Sorry, I think that's actually an interesting idea or interesting discussion there, because I mean, in the long run, if we would include other repositories from CDEvents into the CDEvents.dev site as well, eventually, or how you do it in Tecton, if there are different maintainer groups, for example, for those different repositories, which I assume you have in Tecton, how can you make sure that the combined documentation is consistent and looks good? I mean, if you don't have any overall review on the complete site itself, is that something you're considering and have a way of working for?
Yeah, so we have a documentation working group, and I guess what we do in the documentation working group, it's kind of provide guidelines and the design for what we want the documentation to look like. Yeah, and then we kind of promote these to the other groups. But yeah, so that's a very good point, Emil. So that's kind of the flip side of the coin, because it means that it's not possible for the documentation working group to kind of review and approve documentation changes before they're done. I mean, specifically for Tekton, the problem would be that we wouldn't have enough bandwidth from the documentation team point of view to review those, because it's mostly a couple of folks with very limited amount of time available. So yeah, we end up having inconsistencies that then we have to fix retroactively.
Yeah, and of course that's better to get things out probably and then fix it just as any other. I mean, yeah, I think we cannot review for weeks before we publish something as well. So, and at least not for the CDEvents at this stage anyway, of course. Maybe in the long run.
Yeah. So when I say, oh, sorry, Terry. Go ahead.
No, carry on.
What I was saying is that when I started things, when I set up the website for CDEvents and we created the spec repo, I mean, my initial view was, okay, the CDEvents website would be where we put like more general or high level information about the project and how to reach out to the community and so forth. And then the spec repo would be like the reference for, you know, implementers or things where you get the actual specification. But since it was easy enough to link the spec and to publish it to the website, I thought it was a nice convenience to have, but I never really imagined it in my mind as like the primary place for like the production for the spec side. So I've always imagined like someone contributing to a spec, working on the spec repo and not getting bothered with any rendering aspect on the website. But that was my initial mindset for setting this up. But maybe it's actually good that you're not maybe it's good that you bring this up, because that was just my initial idea. Maybe we need to revise that, and we want the website to be like the primary place for the spec as well. And yeah, so maybe then we should merge the two repos. I'm not sure if it's something that we should do now or maybe after the initial rework is done. It depends a bit on the time. And I think if we go into merging the two repos together now, it will add to the amount of work and timeline that we have to do to get to the end of the rework. But yeah, what do you think?
So this is one of those ones where you're pushing down bumps in a carpet. So the best you can hope for usually is to get all the bumps to end up under the sofa where you can't see them. So let's talk about some of the trade-offs that exist in this space, and then see what makes sense. So I absolutely get where this is today, and from a logical perspective, it does make sense to have the spec in a separate place to the website. There are some technical challenges that affect how well we can make this look as a result of having it this way around. So if you're mastering in GitHub flavored Markdown, then you're fairly constrained in how that's going to be rendered both under GitHub and under Doxy. So, one example of that is that all the images are getting pushed, they're being justified left. Whereas ideally we would like to be able to either center them or flow text around them so that the page looked more polished when people were reading it. So that's one example of a constraint that you have to accept if you're going to master the documentation and have it readable within GitHub. There are bigger problems that we're just beginning to touch upon, which are related to the navigation and structure of Doxy. Because Doxy is intended as a framework for documentation, and so it has a particular expectation on how you structure its documents. And that overall structure is not compatible with direct links in documents to other files. So it expects the links that you're structuring within your documents to be Doxy links rather than hard file references. So once you get beyond a trivial example, you start to run into lots of places where your links don't work in both environments. And we've seen some of that. But there's also another related problem, which is that Doxy really expects lots of nested folders. And it also generates all of its navigation based on that folder structure. So if we're trying to put everything in one folder, which is a submodule from a different repository, we start to quickly run up against problems of how we then render that navigation on the Doxy side. Now, one of the things you might be able to see in a preview of this contributions document is that it renders in the flow of the specification page. So because it all sits under that docs repo, Doxy expects it to be an item in the side menu of that category. Now, it doesn't fit there logically, so I've disabled it so it doesn't show up in the menu, but it still gets rendered in the right pane of the documentation page, which makes it look like the page is broken because it's not in the navigation and it's pointing to something that a different highlighted document in the left pane to the document you're actually viewing. So there are a number of documents like the roadmap document that also start to fall into that category. So as you want to put more information on the site, you're going to find more and more examples of these things that they clash. They don't fit in the same navigational model of the world.
I think I'm starting to lean towards that we should maybe abandon having a GitHub web viewer as a documentation page for the protocol, and have, of course, you should have a README MD and a top level structure of some documents in there which are only then on GitHub and intended for GitHub, and then having the actual official published documentation could still be in the spec repo, then to keep it tightly connected to this to the spec itself, so we have it versioned in the right way and branched and everything. But if we lose the connection to needing it to be viewable in a good way in GitHub, I think we would benefit from that a lot then, and it would make it easier to update the Doxy documentation on CDEvents dev. But to have that as if we should go that way, I think we really need a good way to preview every pull request, the documentation of every pull request, and also have a good way of working with in your own client environment when you update these things, so you can render it in a good way there. But I guess that's just doable. Would we gain a lot, you think, Terry, if we drop the GitHub as a front end for the documentation?
I think the moving the narrative documents into and dropping the submodule, because that would eliminate nearly all the complexity that you're currently having to work around, and would make it really, really easy for everyone to operate on the documentation. So the point against that is, do you have definite requirements for the same situation in the future that you're seeing with Tecton, where you're expecting to have lots of contributors, each with their own repos, pushing loads of content that you want to publish on this external site?
I think what we have discussed in that regard is the SDKs primarily, or as the first things we should maybe then think about if we could somehow include the documentation of the SDKs together with the spec documentation in the official website. So then that would be then the SDK repositories, each of them. But then apart from that, if you would have like event transmitters or event consumers or something like that, such projects, I don't think we need to have generated documentation for those included on the same website. I don't think that will be necessary really. But maybe for the SDKs.
I think maybe there's sorry, let me just do this one piece and then I'll hand over to you. I think possibly what we have here is a need for a roadmap for maturity of this project. Because right now it's mostly you having to maintain all of this documentation. And the hard problem is getting anyone else to join and contribute. So this stage, to optimize for reducing the workload for you and also making it as attractive as possible for other people to get involved and contribute without a steep learning curve. And then moving forwards, if you think that it's likely to become a very, very active project with a lot of contributors in different areas, then start to think about how you would manage that to mitigate the complexity that comes in that direction. I think maybe it would be easier at this stage to just simplify things for the moment, have one source of the truth for anything that you want to publish, and manage that in a versioned way. and then add complexity again later when you need it.
Okay. Yes, well, just shortly going back to the SDKs or multiple website, I just wanted to make a comment on that and saying that, I mean, for Tecton, we have like the API reference, which is generated out of some CRD definitions, and there is some reference for the CLI, which is also generated. So those are imported in with some sync script, but there could be, usually those are like one big page with links within. So, I mean, there are ways we could automate that, just even having a single repo. We could say like every time we make a release on the SDK, it automatically generates a pull request to the web repo that pushes the latest version of that file in there. I mean, it would mean maintaining several copies, but I think it's acceptable. Yeah. For me, having the separate repo, for the spec, I like having the versioning in the tags of the spec specific content on the dedicated repo. I guess that's the main motivation. I see the website as a different thing from the spec, and yeah, so that's in my mind, I see them logically being separated. For me personally, I don't see the big obstacles with the development process, but yeah, I might have a biased view there since I've been working with this for some time, so maybe it seems not a showstopper to me, but maybe it is more complicated. I'm not sure. I understand your point, Terry, that, I mean, for future contributors, we want to keep the development process as lean and straightforward as possible. But I think yeah. No, sorry, we're just thinking that, yeah, if we keep the spec browsable on the spec side, the development process is relatively straightforward. But of course, if like Emil suggested, I mean, we then optimize for review on the web, which makes a lot of sense as well. Yeah, I guess the development process then would become more complex, and we would need to address that complexity.
So
Yeah,
we can still have that versioning mechanism. So you just have a working branch and accept pull requests against that branch, and then have a formal tagged release against that branch, but it's on the CDEvents.deb repo.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about what you said, Terry, on that we shouldn't. I mean, since we are a very small project still, and we cannot afford to have too much of a cumbersome process, and we should make it easy for newcomers to come in and contribute. I wouldn't like to see a process where we scare people away from contributing, because we will, for every pull request they create, we will say that, oh, you didn't update this documentation down here, something strange. That is also needed, and it's not very obvious then how that is done, maybe. So that would be the reason for keeping the spec documentation maybe only in GitHub, and just having the website for the newcomers and for the general information. But on the other hand, I would like to see that we do the work now to make a good looking website with the spec rendered into it, like the big projects have, like Kubernetes and those big projects. So we make it more professionally looking, but we can also render the spec documentation there. But I'm not sure, maybe that isn't not a balance we can take maybe now at this stage with the small projects we have.
Well, it might be worth me doing a separate quick piece of work to, to put up a pull request with all the main narrative documents moved into that doxy repo, just so you can see what that would entail. I won't look at what scripting changes and automation changes we would need to do initially, but just do the piece of work to say, okay, here's how we could handle that, and maybe what you could do is set up a branch on that repo just as a demo working branch, and I'll PR against that, so we're completely separate. But then we could we could explore that and what that does from a simplification point of view.
So what documents are you referring to then that should be moved there from the spec repo?
So I think all the MD files that are in the spec repo that we're currently rendering in that documentation section on the website, rehome them into the other repo.
Yeah, and then we should mimic the branches there, I guess. If we could keep that solution, we should mimic the same branches there as we have in the spec repo, so we can have them hand in hand.
Yeah.
So you mean all the markdown files, including the spec as well?
Yeah. So for the moment, leave the schema files out of this. So it's just the descriptive files defining the vocabulary, and the ancillary stuff like the contributions documents and things like that.
I mean, the JSON files, the schemas themselves, they are not very very extensive. I mean, they lack a lot of commenting and documentation around it. So to me, the spec files, the markdown files specifically for each bucket then in this nomenclature, they are somewhat part of the spec themselves as well. It's not just the schema files that are the spec, to me at least.
Yeah, but I'm just with the schema files, you're pulling those in under automation, aren't you? So they're treated separately at the moment from the rest of the documentation.
They were initially generated from automation, but now we maintain them. So when we do spec changes, we update the schema files accordingly.
Right. But are you expecting the schemas themselves to be rendered on the website?
I wouldn't think so.
No.
I mean, what we discussed in the past was a way to take some of the parts which are manually written in the spec today in the markdown files to be generated automatically from the schema, if possible. So to make it easier, to keep things in sync, and so to avoid having to, keep the schema files and the tables in sync, basically. So I think it's the tables are the main thing that we were thinking about. But yeah, so in the tables you have comments, examples, and things that are not as part of the schema today. So we didn't really, think about a solution for that. It's just something that we said, okay, maybe it will be good to do, but we don't really have a technical solution.
Okay. Well, you
yet.
could still do that on the other repo, as long as everything was directed to a working branch on that repo. You could automate that regardless of where the files lived.
Just a different thought. Maybe it's not that different, but I was thinking of the model that is used by GitHub pages. So where you have a branch that is actually used for publishing. Would it make sense if we were going down the road of having just a single repo to keep the spec repo as the single repo and having a branch that is used for publishing to CDEvents.dev, and have, I don't know, automation in place when we make a new release in the new tag to pull those into the CDEvents.dev branch there. Just thinking out loud.
Okay. I mean, what I'm trying to eliminate at this stage is the need to be able to view these two files in two completely different rendering environments, and the need to have a bunch of complexity to join those two things together. Now, the schemas, they could easily stay in GitHub and be edited on GitHub because they're only ever rendered on GitHub, so it's not a problem for that. Similarly, you could have automation that takes changes to those and pushes changes into your actual narrative documentation. But if your narrative documentation lives in a doxy repo and is only intended to be viewed via doxy, that makes most of the complexity go away, and it makes it easier for you to produce higher quality looking documentation. Yeah, I understand that. But it's I understand that what this is doing is breaking up your conceptual model of what the spec is as an atomic unit, and that might be uncomfortable. So clearly, we need to make sure this is the right decision.
Yeah, I mean, the doxy repo itself could be the spec repo as well, right? I mean, that's just the name of the repo, whether it's spec or CDEvents.dev. That's,
yeah.
I was thinking from a branching point of view, branching model. If we could have what goes on the website being on a dedicated branch.
So what you want from that perspective is you want a default branch, which is the one that's rendered as the documentation that people will see when they come in for the first time. You want the ability to have historical branches so that they can switch to see older versions of the supported specs. And then you want the ability to have a work in progress branch, which is the next release, which is not yet available, but which still provides you with previews to simplify working on it.
I guess we could have tags instead of branches, right? And then it doesn't really matter what branches they live on.
You'll need to work out a mechanism that will work for Netlify.
Okay.
Because you're going to have to host all of these things at separate URLs.
Yeah.
And now that you talk about versions, and Terry comes back to mind, and I think one of the reasons I in my mind I see that the spec and the website repo as separate is because I think the content is versioned differently. So like if we have a new version of a specification, that doesn't mean that we have a new version of the website, like or the other way around. I mean, let's say we make some improvements to the community page, we add some links because now we have a Twitter page or Mastodon page, and we add a link to the Mastodon URL there. That's not really a version information from a spec point of view. It's not specific to any version of the specification. So I would like that to be like available regardless of the version of the specification that I'm browsing, if it makes sense. And so if we have like one single repo where we do like versions on that repo alone, that means that when we are working on, we're doing this change on the working branch, on the default branch, those changes will not be reflected in the historical version of the website. So the community page that I will see if I go switch to version 0.1 is going to be different from the community page that I see if I'm on version 0.2 or if I'm on main.
I think that's going to be a problem regardless, because what's going to happen is that you're going to, when you do a new public release, you're going to create a historical branch of the website, which becomes the baseline of the, sorry, let me word that a different way. It becomes the fixed snapshot of that history. So unless you go and commit to that branch to add additional information, it's always going to be pinned at whatever the version of the whole website was at that point. But you will only be seeing the documentation parts of it, because the only URLs you'll be accessing will be the relative ones that loop you around in the documents section. So if you jump out of that, you should always end up back at the root of the site because of the way the URLs are structured. But yeah, that is a problem, and you're right that you would have to decide whether you were going to make minor non-version related changes to, say, the main branch of the website to update links and progress and things like that, versus working on a branch for spec changes.
Okay, but maybe then a solution to that would, going back to what Emil was suggesting, to kind of keep them more separated than they are today, and say, okay, we have the non-reference documents hosted on the website. So we have the main page, the community page. I guess we could move across information that is not version specific, like roadmap information, like the primer documentation. So all those documents which are not like reference document for the specification that don't need to be versioned, and move them across to the website repo. And then in terms of specification for different versions, we could then have like the drop-down list that only points to the GitHub. So for the reference documentation, we have strictly rendering on GitHub, and for everything else, we do strictly rendering on the website. Then we have like a doxy repo, which is clearly a doxy repo, and we can always publish the latest tag that we want to publish. But it, and then when we have new releases on the specification side, what we do is simply we need to add we need to add a new items in the list in the configuration.
Okay, let me play that back to you to make sure I'm understanding it correctly. I think what you're saying there is that we take away the submodule. We have some documentation in that docs site on CDEvents dev, and then where we want to refer to the actual specification, we send people to GitHub to read the specification page on GitHub. Is that correct?
Yeah, that was what I was suggesting. And everything that is not associated to a specific version, so that is not strictly specification, like the roadmap, the primer, we could move across to the CDEvents.dev repo so that they become part of the doxy repo.
Okay, yeah, I think that would solve the same set of problems. Because if we remove the submodule and the requirement to be able to render in two different places, that gets rid of most of the hard.
Yeah.
And it's things like the primer, which are actually documents that need to be prettier. So they would benefit from being on the other side of the fence. And as you say, they don't need to be updated with the rest of the spec necessarily, because once we've got it there, there'll be very little additional information that needs to go into that document. So yeah, that might be a better compromise to go in that direction.
Yeah, I think that sounds like an appealing compromise to me as well. I mean, if we should get something done in a reasonable amount of time as well. And of course, in the long run, I would like to see, I mean, if the project grows, and I would like to see that we could also render the specification documents some way, so it becomes more professionally looking and maybe more easier to browse than what GitHub provides today, with more features. But to get going now and to get this out there, I think that's probably the best compromise we could come up with.
Okay. All right, well, let me put together an example of that, and then let's see how that works.
So what about the versions then? Should we somehow publish each new release of the spec to the website anyway, and with proper links then to each GitHub tag, or how should we, what kind of version references should we have from the website then?
Well, we
But
can
I guess
still carry on with the same proposal. So, you can keep main on CDEvents.dev as your default landing page. And then you can start to create historical branches of that to allow you to have historical supported releases that are linked on the website. So all of that will still function, and you'll still be able to point it to specific tagged releases of the spec on the other repo. So as long as we use the right links to the spec documentation, that should be fine.
So I think we should keep the drop-down menu then for the versions, or
yeah, that will still function. We can probably automate some of the links. Maybe I'll have to experiment with that. We may be able to put a variable in the system that says which version of the spec repo we should be pointing at, and then you've only got to change that in one place to change all the links when you update.
I guess there's no possibility to have like a pane in the website where we could actually browse the GitHub page.
Well, I was going to experiment with that quietly and then present it as oh look, we can do this. I think we can do. Need to check it to make sure it doesn't give us any horrible artifacts. But yeah, in theory, we could do that.
Yeah, because I guess then you would anyway be logged in with your own GitHub user, so you will see what you're allowed to see from GitHub.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if it's possible then to hide some of the GitHub menus when you do such an included frame or whatever it could be called. iframe, yeah.
That might get messy and fragile.
Yeah.
One of the things that I have learned from maintaining the MLOps roadmap on GitHub is that they do have a habit of changing the markdown rendering and breaking things. So I've had to go back and patch stuff occasionally because I've gone to look at the site and it's not rendering correctly anymore. So there are issues about having to stay on top of this stuff because the landscape is shifting underneath you as well.
Good notes, Andrea.
Okay, thanks. So, yeah, if I miss something, please add it to the notes. But I think we kind of have agreed next steps, and I think it was very good discussion to flesh out all the different point of view and possibilities on these. So thanks for that. Yeah. And I've seen GitHub announce some, I don't remember what it's called, but it's basically the ability to draw some JavaScript within GitHub rendered and pages, to build more like interactive pages within GitHub. So I think, that might be something that we could use to make those pages more dynamic, but yeah, or maybe something else. But yeah, so anything else that we need to clarify before we can move forward? What is the timeline for this? Maybe Terry, does it still fit with?
Yeah, I mean, it shouldn't be that much effort to to do that. So, you know, hopefully I'll be able to do that overnight or in the morning, and get something out for you.
Okay.
So, you know, we can then look at it in preview and play with it. I'm just finishing off an update on the primer, where I've put in a bunch more of just sort of basic introductory stuff, because the experience I had coming in was that I wanted to land a bit earlier in the thinking process, and so I've just put some stuff in there that ties all of this back to the enterprise integration patterns stuff. And I've also put in just a basic section on, you know, what's the problem that we're actually solving, with a couple of diagrams to show, you know, how your default is lots of isolated build systems that can't talk to each other and exchange audit information and stuff, versus the ability to be much more interconnected and integrated. So in there, but you know, that's the other piece that I want to get delivered.
Sounds good.
The only huge argument that we need to have is whether we should have a fixed line width on text documents.
Is that an argument? Yeah.
Go on.
Doesn't it increase, improve readability if the lines are not too long?
Well,
if that's
for
possible.
text documents, you should have wrap on.
Yeah, sure. But anyway, I mean, when I look at things on my widescreen monitor, I don't want the text to go all the way, always. Of course, I can shrink the window then to fit it to be able to read it better, but I will lose track of the lines, I think, if they are too long. I'm not sure.
So the flip side of that is, if you put lots of extra line feeds in.
No line feeds, of course. Yeah. Rather than just having margins or like column widths or something like that on your text itself.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you're going to have a fixed line width, you've got to have a new line in the middle of a paragraph somewhere.
No, you shouldn't type any new line characters, I think, in the text. They still should wrap, but you decide on the column width or the whole text blob, how wide it should be. Just much like the narrowing the window, but without narrowing it, just saying that now the window is narrower, or the text should be narrower. Maybe I'm not making sense, maybe.
Well, that's not what the linter is expecting, is it? The linter is expecting to find a line ending at less than whatever the fixed line length is.
Ah, okay, you're talking about the linter. Yeah, that's another thing. Was that the question?
Yeah.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
sorry. Sorry. Then I rest my case.
Because that's what that means, is that we're having to put artificial line breaks in paragraphs, and then you end up with hidden spaces on the end of some of the lines, and then you have to go through and find them all and remove them. And then when you render it, the renderer has to take all those new lines out and turn it back into a paragraph again.
Yeah, I mean, there are pros and cons in both approaches, really. I mean, I don't mind one specifically, just striving for consistency, and we are probably not consistent today, as you said, but I don't want to like do like document specific exceptions, but I think the moment that we actually move things across to the other repo, it probably makes it easier, or we can, I don't know. Or we could try to keep the same. I mean, I don't mind having like the long paragraphs. That works for me as well. It just
You're right that we should be
Yeah.
consistent. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, having fixed line lengths for code and XML and stuff like that makes more sense. It's purely for the narrative documents where it adds some problems from a maintenance perspective.
Okay. Yeah. We should probably exclude that rule then, like in the global length config. I don't know. So it does not apply to any of the narrative documents. But yeah, okay.
Yeah, I think that would in some sense actually improve the review process a bit as well, because then you don't get a lot of extra new line changes just because you have added a word in the beginning of the paragraph on a long line.
That's true, yeah.
But yeah, I don't have a very strong opinion.
Yeah, I mean, GitHub ability to highlight the differences in lines, long lines has been improving over time.
Okay,
it's probably better now than it was before. So yeah, as I said, there are pros and cons. It depends on the tools that you use mostly. But yeah, I'm fine with having long paragraphs. Just like them to be consistent across the repo. But yeah, I think we are at time, and I definitely don't think that's a stopping issues in any case. But yeah, so thanks for the good discussion. Yeah, look forward to the next revision then, Terry.
Okay, I'll go and sort all that out and get back to you as soon as possible.
Cool.
Great.
Thanks. Good
Talk
to
to
see
you.
you.
Good to see you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.